Well, glad to be back. Sir, last year must not scare everybody away. Todd asked me back again. Todd and I were talking about what to cover in this time period and a lot of different subjects, maybe taking a deeper dive in the soil test and soil testing, that type of thing. My name is Ken Ferrie and own and operate with my family Crop Tech Consulting in Central Illinois. So we do a lot of soil testing and fertility recommendations for our customers, have been for over 35 years. But the problem with getting deep on a soil test and that kind of thing is a lot of you guys probably all have different types of soil tests, different types of extractions, different types of methods of pulling, and it gets kind of confusing trying to hone in on one soil test that your agronomist may not be using. I said, why don't we address the elephant in the room, the thing that we're dealing with every day at our office right now? Where are commodity prices? Where are fertilizer prices? They're high, right? So are a lot of other prices. So we're in an inversion there, and that generates a lot of phone calls in the office. How are we going to navigate through these tight margins and how things are swinging? And the reality is, right, when we think about farming, you gray hairs in here have seen it, right? We know that farming, the economic cycle of farming basically is a 7-year cycle. 7 years peak to peak, 7 years valley to valley. Unfortunately, we're in the valley, right? We're moving down into some tough margins and probably got another year, year and a half down there before we start to climb back up. What's the cure for low prices? Low prices. What's the cure for high prices? High prices. That's just the way it works, right? And if you've been farming long enough and you learned it before you went broke, you realize that this is going to happen, right? And you prepare for it. If you're starting your farming career right now, this year, that's a good thing. Why is that a good thing? Yeah, you learn how to live without, right? You figure out what you're going to do. If you start your career on the upswing when we have large profits, that's a challenge. Why? You have cash flow problems, too much, right? And what do you do with too much cash flow? Can't pay taxes, we got to buy things, right? And then we get two jet skis and a Denali, right? And then the market goes the other way, and we can't eat any of them, a situation where, and the quicker you figure out that process, the longer your farming career will be, and the more profitable you'll be at the end when you check out of farming. In a situation where a lot of guys that, once you figure that out, right, when are you doing your actual machinery purchasing and land purchasing? On the peak or the valley? Comes in the valley, right? You'll be expanding in the valley because implements are often their cost, meaning that combines are cheaper, land is cheaper, and that type of thing. So today, though, I want to give you some take-home nuggets of how we're going to navigate through this fertilizer situation and think about the process or the steps that we would walk our growers through. And if you come into my office and I say, oh man, we got to cut. How much we got to cut? I don't know, but we got to cut. How much you spending now? I don't know, but too much. We got to cut. That's a panic going on. He's reacting to the coffee shop talk and not real numbers. You got to sit him down and say, what is it going to take to make this thing cash flow? Where do you have to be? Where's those yields need to be? And are we talking about taking $5, $15, $50, $100 out of your fertilizer program? What do we need to do to make this thing work? And then you work backwards from there. And then, granted, I'm in the business, but we're going to use soil test to drive those decisions. We have a program with our customer base when they're really up against it from a cash flow situation. We call it the Army program, allocating resources to maintain yield. And in that case, not just moving nutrients around within the field. We'll put farms in a budget, and we may take fertilizer from that farm and put it on that farm to help us in the valley, to stave it off so we know we're putting on less than removal, but we're doing it with the idea that we're stabilizing cash flow, and then we're going to come back and fill that back in when we're on the other side of that valley. One thing you'll figure out real quick in your young farming career, that the better off your soil fertility is, the easier it is to ride these storms, okay, to be able to deal with it. So we think about a soil test. This is from Iowa State, looking at a Bray 1 test, which would be a little different than Malik or an Olson. But they're saying, what's your odds of being able to get a return on investment to fertilizer? If your P1 level is 18 to 25 parts per million, that's a 25% chance that you're going to get a payback potash in that 170 to 220, basically 3% range, you're going to get 25% chance you're going to get a return on the fertilizer you apply. As you get lower than that, that possibility goes up. As you get higher than that, it softens. Okay? Now, this is a range, and we say 18 to 25 parts per million. If you got $6 corn and cheap fertilizer, it's going to be at the upper end of that range. If you got expensive fertilizer and cheap corn, it'll be at the bottom end of that range within there. But it gives us a rule of thumb, and we know what they're worth. When we look at a soil test, what are the odds of us pulling back? So pulling back in this range, that's going to work. Pulling back in this range, we got to think about yield potential, yield loss. So what I want to do is think about the nutrients you got to work with, and you got sulfur and zinc and boron and phosphorus and potash and limestone and nitrogen. Of all the nutrients you got to work with, and you're going to start pulling back, or you want to pull back your expense, which one do we have to be very careful with pulling back? Nitrogen, right? And we say you run out of nitrogen, the fat lady sings, she's over. Don't matter what your other levels are, you just shot yourself in the foot. So you have to think about that as being one that you protect. So nitrogen deficiency starts at the tip, right? Goes down the midrib, fans out. So this plant, not only is it nitrogen deficient based on its color, it's still nitrogen deficient, okay? Versus this one is nitrogen deficiency, but it's got dark green on it, so this was deficient. So when we think about nitrogen out here, this is a timing issue. This one was low on nitrogen for a period of time, it cannibalized itself, and then something happened that nitrogen deficiency disappeared. What could happen to make nitrogen deficiency stop in your cornfield? Side dress, put on more nitrogen, rain, could do it, right? But if you're nitrogen deficient and you're dark green, getting on your high clearance machine and Y drop an N in there won't do any difference, won't make any difference because it's not deficient anymore. It's a timing issue, so you look at your timing. But if it's running out of nitrogen and it's pale yellow, and it's yellow up to the top, or like these behind here, that's an ongoing nitrogen deficiency. So this plant picked up 7 to 10 pounds a day in the rapid growth stage. When it gets to pollination from here on, from pollination on, you got 60 days, you get 2 pounds a day. So you still got to pick up 120 pounds of it. And if you're one of those guys that just doesn't feel good without running out of nitrogen sometime during the year, you want a little yellow corn, have it early. Don't have it late. This is very expensive when it runs out late because that's your fill window. Okay? But that's one that we got to guard as far as cutting the N rate. If you're going to cut the N rate, what do you need to do with your nitrogen? You need to break it up. So every time you break up the N, you pick up about 10% efficiency. So you can make 180 pounds of N work like 200, but you're going to split some on the planter, you're going to split some in the side dress. So I can't split, I got too many ball games to go to in the summertime, I can't be side dressing. But you're going to have to do something. You can't make that gap in there without it, meaning that trying to protect it from the loss. When we think about the other nutrients, I want to touch back on removal rates. So we'll review that a little bit. So we know that in a bushel of corn, there's 0.34 pounds of P2O5 and 0.23 pounds of K2O. How do we know that? At CropTech, we send hundreds of samples off for nutrient analysis of grain, and we do it from 150 bushel the acre corn to 300 bushel corn. We're looking to see is there difference between varieties, difference between those yields. And this average is here. So these are my numbers that I'm talking about. And we're saying 250 bushel corn takes 86 pounds of P2O5, 57 pounds of K2O. Or in DAP terms, it takes 190 pounds of DAP and 100 pounds of potash. That's what's leaving the truck going down the road. That's hard math. We know it because we can analyze that corn for what's in it. But that's not everything. We got to grow this crop, right? We got to grow the roots, we got to grow the tassels, we got to grow it. So its uptake is different. So when we look at 250 bushel corn, what is the uptake, total uptake? That's 276 pounds of DAP, 561 pounds of OO60. And there's where farmers stumble once in a while. They say, well, removal rate is only 60 pounds of K2O or 100 pounds of potash. But potash, there's not much potash in the grain. A lot of potash in the stalk, but not much in the grain that leaves, okay? So when you think about potash, you think about nitrogen, it takes 1.6 pounds of N to raise a bushel of corn. You don't put that much on because the soil ponies up the rest. You might put 1 or 1.1 on, and the soil ponies up the rest. We think about potash, 250 bushel corn are going to be bumping up there 330 some pounds of nitrogen. It's going to be 330, 40 pounds of potash to build it, okay? To build it. So we think about how much potash that it actually takes. If we throw soybeans in the mix, 75 bushel beans, uptake is 158 pounds of DAP, 275 pounds of potash to build that crop. So if we think about a 2-year cycle, we were doing a corn soybean situation, we talk about removal, what got in the truck and went to the elevator. If I'm growing 250 bushel corn and 75 bushel beans, that's 300 pounds of DAP, 250 pounds of potash per acre that left the field. If I look at uptake, that's 434 pounds of DAP, 836 pounds of potash in a 2-year uptake. Now, we don't have to put that potash on. Why? We have to worry more about removal, but what happens to the potash that's left in the stalk and the phosphorus in the stalk? It recycles, right? But when a grower comes in, he says, I'm only putting on removal, that may work if his fertility level is high enough to meet the uptake, okay? But if he can't meet the uptake, removal's not going to do it, okay? Then we're going to have problems. You think about potash, right? In corn, potash is disease prevention, helps you get pollinated without any hiccups. Standability is huge, right? Making it stand. In soybeans, it's basically hanging onto the pods and giving it plant health and managing water. Potash is huge in managing the water. You do not want to go into a drought potash deficient in that situation. So when we think about this recycling process, potash is different than phosphorus. So when we think about phosphorus, sulfur, nitrogen, zinc, boron, all of those are tied up in the carbon structure of this plant. They're caught up in carbon chains. To get them to recycle, they're going to have to be decomposed by microbes that live in the soil. Where we are here, I imagine it takes somewhere between 3.5 and 4 years for you to decompose a corn crop and completely cycle it back in the system. Where we are in Illinois, it's going to be closer to 4 years. You get to central Iowa, 4.5, Mankato, Minnesota type. It takes them about 5 years to decompose a complete corn cycle back in the system. Why does it take them Minnesota guys so long? Why are they so slow? Colder. It's all driven by microbes. Microbes are driven by temperature as part of that. Potash is different. Potash stays in the sap of the plant. So potash isn't tied up. It's kind of like at humans. Potash is in your blood, in the sap, if you want to say, and it's in the sap of the plant. So if we had a hailstorm here today with a little bit of rain, we literally would rain potash on the ground. It would leak right out of those leaves, okay? And we'd have a big potash deficiency in the plant. By the time you run the combine through this corn, a bunch of your potash is already back in the ground because it's rained a few times and the water runs across the leaf, flushes it out. And by next spring, we're ready to cycle some of the remaining back in there. Your phosphorus, your sulfur, your nitrogen has to be decomposed. So that's going to take time to turn those cycles. So when we look at phosphorus values of where that's at, okay? So when we think about that, we think about the soybean. Soybean is a different bird. As I told the other groups, the good Lord puts soybeans on earth just to frustrate me, okay? Soybeans do not respond to management. Soybeans respond to their environment. You can be a great corn manager, and you can make things happen out here in the field with your side dressing, your starter, your fungicide, and all that. You throw all that at a soybean, and it just laughs at you, right? It responds to its environment. So it's a scenario where it's a tougher bird to handle. Soybeans respond to soil fertility. They respond less to applied fertility. Where corn, we can do things with applied fertility and corn will respond to it. With soybeans, it's tougher to do. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about pulling levels down. When we think about a soybean, at V7, 7 trifoliates, the dry matter, it's a straight linear line up, and so is phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen. We hope it's making this nitrogen. It's a straight line up in nutrient uptake. Okay? And that happens at a very rapid pace. So if we think about V7 soybeans is very similar to V6, V8 corn. So V6, V8 corn goes in the rapid growth stage, and it flat fly, and they're putting on a node every 3 days, sucking up 7, 10 pounds of nitrogen, and just so you can hear corn grow. for soybeans, that's V7. From V7 on, it's game on. Nutrients are cranking into that plant. But you need those nutrients in the soil for soybeans. Trying to apply them gets to be a little bit tougher. So when we think about that uptake, from V7, we're at 20% potash uptake. The next 35 days from V7 on, we got to get to 80%. That's 175 pounds of potash per acre has got to get in that crop at the tune of 5 pounds a day. A big sucking machine when it comes to potash. So where your soil is when this happens kind of drives this whole process. Todd had a plot that he brought some samples in. This is a field that's low in potash. And you can see where no potash has been applied. These beans are kind of drying up a little bit. But they got the crispy edges from the potash deficiency up here in the leaves, the stunting in here. And he went out and applied some potash by hand and was fortunate enough to get rain on it, and the crop's responding, right? So this is applied potash versus the potash deficiency. Then next to it, the potash here was applied last year. And the response to soil fertility is huge, especially for soybeans. So keep that in mind as you think about what you're cutting, where you're cutting it in that scenario. We've tried to go out and apply potassium nitrate to soybeans at R1 to see if we can fix some of this. It's a struggle. So the blue line here is where we have the check, and the pink line is where we applied it. We can't get it to respond in that situation. We've also tried nitrogen. So this plot, I put on 250 pounds of nitrogen, 550 pounds of nitrogen, 800 pounds of nitrogen on soybeans, and I got 6 bushel. Does that cash flow? Does for the co-op, but it didn't go cash flow for you guys, right? So we look at a soil test, and we know where we want to be to get that optimum ROI. So we got to lift it up. How are we going to do that? Well, if we go by the numbers, it takes 18 pounds of P2O5 to raise 1 part per million on the soil test of phosphorus. It takes 8 of potash. So let's say you have a low testing soil of 7 parts per million. You're down in there to where that's an 85% return. You're down here 7 parts per million. There's an 80% chance that you're going to get a return on your investment. And you want to get it to 25 parts per million. You got to raise it 18 parts per million. It's going to take 18 pounds of P2O5 to do that. So you got to get 324 pounds of P2O5 out there. You're using DAP 18460. So to get 325 pounds of P2O out there, you got to put on 700 pounds of DAP above removal.
You got to do that in the fall for soybeans.
And you got to do it in the fall. It's a good question, a good answer there, but you got to do it every year. So if I decided that I want to build this in 6 years instead of 4, right? Then I can divide this by 6. So if I'm raising 80 bushel beans, I got to put on 125 pounds of DAP for removal. I got to put on another 120 pounds to build and start my build process. But I'm only building 3 parts per million per year. So of my 6 years, if I started at 7, 3 of them are going to be down into this lower profit range. See what I'm saying? But building it up, phosphorus builds up easier, comes down slower. Potash is hard to build, and it'll drop like a rock if you take your eyes off of it, because potash is leachable. We can flush it out of the soil. So if I have 126 parts per million of potash and I want to go to 220, I'm going to have to put on 752 pounds of K2O, which is 1,250 pounds of 0060, and that means I'm going to have to put on 200 pounds above removal for 6 years every year to bring this level back up. So what I'm trying to hint is when you drag this field down, it's a long way back. There's no quick fixes to this whole situation out there. So so we could, we can calculate this. So why soil test so often? We test every 2 years. Why not just test 1 year and then let the math do it? Know the removal. We should be able to predict where your soil test is going to be in 5 years, 10 years. Well, I'm here to tell you, as a guy who makes his living soil testing, it don't work that way. It wasn't designed to work that way, and it don't work that way. A soil test is just an indicator of what values are and whether or not you're going to pay from getting a fertilizer. Okay? But it's a good indicator. If you check your blood pressure in the morning and it's normal, does that mean it's going to stay normal all day? No. But if it's high in the morning right after you get up, what's a pretty good sign? It go and say hi all day, right? You probably have something that should be checked out, right, in that scenario. So I'm showing you some examples of farms that we soil test on, live examples. This one is sampled before the 21 crop. It's got 41 parts per million of phosphorus, so that's high. 323 on the potash, so that's strong. So we don't put any fertilizer on for 2 years. And we come back in 2023 to test it. And my phosphate should be 33 parts per million, but it's clear down to 22. My potash should be around 250 if my math's right, and it's clear down to 212. Poof, she dropped. And then we got to step back in and we got to put fertilizer on. Right? That didn't work the way the math said it would. This one is at 28 phosphorus, 2% K. So I'm going with 250 potash, 200 a DAP on my corn year, just potash on my bean year. I come back, I should be around 25 parts per million in phosphorus. It's at 22, I'm pretty close. And my potash has went to 2.1. So I put another 200 of potash, 200 of DAP, and I come back with 200 of potash head of the beans. I should be around 22 parts per million. It's at 23. My potash is climbing at 2.3. That's the way the math is supposed to work, and it looks good. This one here is another high one at 41 parts per million, 2.1. I want to raise that potash, so no DAP is applied for 2 years. It should drop this to 33 parts per million, but it's 38, so that's pretty good. So I go another round with just potash, no DAP, and it should drop the phosphate to 25 parts per million, but it's 42. It's 1 part per million higher than it was 4 years ago, and I'm putting fertilizer on. How the hell did that happen? Right? But I'm telling you, that's the way it is. Okay, think of soil testing a little bit like a bobber when you're fishing, right? It's out there, it's a floating scenario, and in shallow waters they run rough, and when you got low fertility levels, you're going to see that bobber moving up and down in the rough waters. In deep water, we run calm, and the bobber's not going to move as much. So high values don't tend to move as much as lower values tend to move faster. But soil testing is not an exact science, it's just a predictor. So think of it like showing a pig at the fair, right? What do you do? How do you show a pig at the fair? You take a stick and it goes this way, you tap it back. You want to go this way, you tap it. That's about what we're doing. And I'm making a living off soil testing. It's like driving an aircraft carrier, right? We don't turn it, we situation it's going to move slow. So why is that? Why is it not predictable? Well, it's because we think about the soil test as an inventory of the soil, and it's not even close. It's a predictor of availability. So if we look at nitrogen alone, in most soils there's between 3,000 and 6,000 pounds of nitrogen out there. We only want 200-300, but we're only going to get about 2 to 3%, 40 to 90 pounds. Some of our soils in Illinois have 12,000 pounds. So again, you can grow 300 bushel corn, 150 pounds applied in. Okay? We think about potash. 30 to 50,000 pounds of potash per acre out there. Okay? Now think of potash, again, when we talk about solubility of potash, it's like weathering a mountain. Okay? So it's not biologically weathered, it's time over time weathered. And there's only about 300 to 600 pounds that will become available, and there'll be 6 pounds in the soil solution at one time. What did I tell you the soybean needed for 35 days? 5 pounds, and there's only 6 available if we're in that 3 or 4% range. Phosphate, 2,000 to 3,000 pounds of P2O5 in your soil, but only 0.01 to 0.1 will be orthophosphate. So orthophosphate, or water-soluble phosphate, if I took your soil test, or your soil had a screen at the bottom, poured water in the top, deionized water, water would come out the bottom. If I check the water, there'll be phosphate in it. That's ortho-P, okay? And your soil would carry from probably a 0.01 to about a 2 parts per million of ortho. Ortho is what that plant uses. So we're doing a Bray test, 25 parts per million, and we know that if we're above 60 degrees in temperature at around 25 parts per million, you're going to produce 1.5 to 3 parts per million of ortho. That's enough to feed 300 bushel corn, 90 bushel beans. So why don't we test for ortho? Why are we testing for Brays and Olsons and everything else? This changes by the hour. It'll be different at 8 o'clock in the morning than it would be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This ortho is 100% made by biologics, by the biology in your soil, the microbes in your soil. Okay? So you guys have seen it. Plant corn, it gets up, things are going, then the temperature goes south, it's 45 degrees. What's the corn do? Turns purple, crappy. There's no Ortho P available. 24 hours after it warms up, the color comes back because the biology, the microbes in the soil wake up and they produce this phosphorus. Okay? So this soil test is predicting what availability looks like once the soil wakes up. Okay? So it's different than what we think. So if it's driven off of soil biology, the soil microbes, one of the first things we want to look at on a soil test and we're trying to pull back is pH. So I said nitrogen's number 1, pH is right behind it. You cannot let the pH slip in your soil because the microbes don't like that. So think about that. You're going to the 4th of July picnic. Somebody made you an egg sandwich with mayonnaise on it, put it on the kitchen or the picnic table today. It sat there for 2 or 3 hours. You ate that sandwich, where are you going to watch the fireworks from? Yeah. But you go in a restaurant, grab a bottle of ketchup that's been on the counter for a week, put it on your fries, and nothing happens. What's ketchup got that egg sandwich don't have? It's acid. Microbes can't grow in acidity. So when we think about acidity out there, if you could see the herd, the livestock that's decomposing this crop, in a soil that's got a 6.5 pH, you've got about 12 cows, or 1,200 cows at 1,000 pounds apiece. That's a living soil biology that's chewing up this crop. Let that pH drop to a 5.4, you got 2 cows out there. So you can't cycle the nutrients. So limestone gets cut pretty quick, but you want to keep your pH in that optimum range to keep the soil rolling on that process. Then you can work on your 4 R's, such as your starter fertilizer. You're splitting your nitrogen out there to make that work. But if you pick up a new farm and a grower comes in and it's single-digit phosphates, 5.4s, 5.7 pHs, how much cutting can we do here? You cannot without adjusting yield goal. Okay, the yield goal. You got to adjust the yield goal. So this grower here, he wants to cut his fertilizer bill. He's single-digit phosphates. He's 2% Ks. And he's telling me that he's using removal rates on this farm. And I'm looking at soil testing. No, you're not using removal rates. He said, yeah, I am. I said, let's talk about your removal rates. So he takes a U of I, University of Illinois removal rates, but he divides them in half because he's strip tilling. You're more efficient when you strip till, so I cut my rate in half. Strip till does not change the math. It makes you more efficient when you band your phosphate, but it doesn't cut the math. And then he's using liquid. So that's 25% more efficient than dry fertilizer. So he cuts the U of I rates by 75%. And in about 5 or 6 years, and now he's got yield problems. So efficiencies are different than total pounds going down the road. The biologicals, to wrap up, are the same thing. A lot of biologicals out here doing a lot of things, but when somebody shows up and they're going to sell you a few ounces of a biological product to replace 200, 300, 400 pounds of fertilizer, let the hair stand up on your neck because it doesn't work that way. Okay? They don't have that horsepower to do it. Yeah, they can tell you all these nutrients in the soil and we're going to flush them loose, but the number's still going down. So be careful in that situation. There's quite a bit of work on that as far as breaking them down or speeding them up, that type of thing. We've done some plot work with it. The work that we've done so far, we haven't been able to prove anything. There's no way to measure it. We know we can do it with nitrogen. So I go out here in the corn stalks and I put different applications of nitrogen rate on the fall and maybe hit it with a turbo till or something like that. You come spring, you'll know where the nitrogen strips are. The corn will be blacker, more decomposed. Where you didn't put it on, it'll still look like it went through the combine. But nitrogen is a bug food, right? There's no way to put nitrogen on this soil without exciting the microbes. And I don't know 100% whether speeding it up is a good thing or a bad thing, right? I know if we go further south here, they don't want to speed it up. Why?